Jan. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this lecture / book launch, and not with one lecturer, but with two speakers. I'm very happy that we have Andrew Canessa and our CEDLA colleague Dana Brablec here to talk about their new book. Let me just show you what it is. Well, of course, it's this cover. I will let the book circulate, but it was released just a few months back.
Yeah.
September last year. Yeah, so still quite fresh, and we're very happy to have you both, bringing some of the key insights from the book, which is on urban indigeneities, not just in Latin America. So I think that is also really nice that you have worked with scholars who have case studies from around the world, but with quite a strong Latin American dimension to it, if only because of you editors, but also because of the chapters. I think also with the group of speakers today, we have a bit that Latin American focus, but with a broader scope as well. So let me very briefly introduce to you our speakers and also our discussant. Andrew Canessa is from the University of Essex, a social anthropologist, professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology, and you work mainly or focus on the big themes of not just race and indigenous peoples, but also gender and sexuality. You have a lot of research experience in Bolivia, but also in other places. And of course, you're already working for a long time from the UK. Dana was quite near to you in the UK, in the University of Cambridge for many years before she came to Amsterdam to work with us. She is now an assistant professor of race, decoloniality, and intersectionality, a sociologist by training. You've done most of your research in Chile, among Mapuche people in Santiago de Chile, but you've also worked on Roma in the Netherlands, in Czech Republic, so already also that kind of broader scope. And I'm very pleased that we have Adriana Churampi from Leiden University with us. She's a colleague in the Netherlands for a long time. She also works on indigenous people, mainly in the Andean region. You're from Peru originally, but apart from your research work there, you've also worked on the Caribbean and on the Dominican Republic. So again, also quite a broader scope that you bring into this meeting. So as usual, after we have the presentations, we will ask our discussants to kick off the discussion for us, help us a little bit to organize also our thoughts, but we will leave sufficient time so every one of you can have, can bring thoughts or questions to our two speakers. And my name is Barbara Hoogboom, for some people that may not know me, director of CEDLA. After we have finished here at 5 o'clock, we invite you all upstairs for drinks and for more informal exchange of thoughts. So I will circulate the new book so you can have a bit of a view while listening. I will also circulate two books that we have in our library from Andrew Canessa. This was the one that you came to the old CEDLA, or CEDLA in the old building some 10 years back. And maybe good for all of you to know that after this summer, we will move again. We will move back to the more historical center of the city of Amsterdam, very near to where the new university library is opening. We will let you know more, but for those of you who are here now and may not be able to come for a next lecture before the summer break, be aware that the next lecture series will be in another location again. I leave it to you, Dana, Andrew. I don't know what order you had.
It's like we're going to mix this up, and we've decided that we're going to interrupt each other to try and make it a bit more dialogic. We'll see how that works.
So whenever the other one is speaking, things are nonsense, the other one will, come.
Exactly.
Thank you for the invitation. Nice to be here.
But you're going to start.
No, but thank you for your words, Barbara, and thank you for coming to this presentation. It's not going to be formally like a book launch, I would say, but mostly we will be discussing the most relevant topics from the book, the common, issues that emerge from the chapters that deal with the Latin American region. And I hope that our presentation will lead to a discussion after, of course, Adriana's discussion. And a topic that, while increasingly relevant and significant, we think that still harbors many underexplored dimensions, which is, indigenous urbanization. And as editors, we are very happy about this product, this book, because it joins a very limited collection of volumes of books that deal with increasing urbanization of indigenous peoples from an international point of view. And differently to other books that also deal with this topic of indigenous urbanization, this book, our book, we take on a more global perspective to discuss indigenous urbanization. And we think that that's something really unique about this particular book, because we included cases from very different, contexts, including, Russia, Japan, Fiji, Canada, Chile, Bolivia, Brazil, and Peru. And I remember all of them. So you can see that they are.
And now I'm going to interrupt. So one of the interesting things, when we were pitching this to the University of Arizona Press, I thought the best title is Urban Indigeneities, but surely somebody has published a book before on urban indigeneities. And the answer is no. Actually, this is genuinely the first book out there that looks at indigenous urban experience across the globe. And so that is, I think, is an important point. And I think that we were very lucky that nobody got to the title before us.
No, and also I have to interrupt you again. Perhaps it's also looking at urban indigenous peoples, urban indigeneity, indigenous urbanization as not as an exceptional phenomenon, but as the main, topic, as the main theme. Because this is being, slowly constituting the norm, the urbanization of indigenous peoples globally, including, the Latin American region. So I wanted to, hopefully this is going to work. I really like this slide. It took me a long time to get it, ready. And I wanted to share just how this, journey began. And this was basically with an understanding of the critical relevance of indigenous urbanization, not only as a field, as an academic field, right, worthy of deeper exploration, but also as a priority area that was highlighted by the new urban agenda that was adopted by the UN, the United Nations Conference on Housing and Sustainable Development. This was from 2016 in Quito, Ecuador, and in which basically it presented a vision for a better and more sustainable futures, but with this main idea of not leaving anyone behind. And in this idea of anyone behind, of course, indigenous peoples in cities were included. And global urbanization is a sustained upward trend that increasingly includes indigenous peoples as well. So indigenous peoples are part of this, global urbanization, or the increasing urbanization that the world is experiencing. And although still the majority of indigenous peoples still reside in rural areas, data shows that more and more indigenous peoples are migrating to cities. And this could be, rural to urban migration, could also be, crossing an international border from country to country. And also whether on a temporal base or more permanently. And urbanization is then not only impacting the ways of life, ways of living of indigenous peoples, globally, but also how we think about urban infrastructures, and also considering how we design, how we implement, urban policies. Urban policies for the future, and taking into account the increasing, presence of indigenous peoples in cities. And surprisingly, or perhaps not so much, when I first started to articulate this project on indigenous urbanization, I encountered, and this is also revealed by what Andrew said, the lack of a book that dealt with, this issue of indigenous urbanization. A rather scarce landscape of contemporary literature that was, dealing with the urbanization of indigenous peoples, dealing with this urban context and not as an example, right, when discussing rural indigeneity. And this gap in the academic discourse basically led me to organize an international conference. This is back to 2019, so before joining CEDLA and the University of Amsterdam, in which I wanted to gather, researchers, practitioners that were basically studying, working in this area of indigenous urbanization, including people who self-identified as indigenous peoples themselves, and also people who were not indigenous. And here the role of Andrew was very important, because Andrew was the keynote speaker of this conference. And then together we started with this translation process, the translation of the papers, of the presentations into the chapters of the book. I'm saying, wanted to say something?
I wanted to say something. So I want to go back a slide. This is actually quite important.
Which one?
That one. So,
the photo, yeah.
Yeah, so Dana is telling us about how this all came apart, and it's actually very, very important. You see that her name is before my name, and there are two reasons for this. One is the most obvious one, is alphabetic. But had her name been Sukovsky with a Z, her name would still have gone first, right? And this is actually important. It just happens to be alphabetic. Because we must acknowledge that it really is very much Dana's idea who put us all together. I was just a discussion, and I did the editing, and we wrote the introduction together and all of that. But this is very much Dana's project.
Oh, it is mine, all mine. No, but Andrew collaborated a lot as well in helping me with his experience in crafting, also from an editorial point of view, in putting everything together nicely into the book that is somewhere here circulated. There it is, thank you. And given the scope of the book, I already told you that we included very different cases, Peru and Russia, for instance. Also, the topics discussed vary a lot. But despite all the historical, economic, political differences from Japan to Bolivia, we still were able to identify several common, themes and topics that suggested a shared experience among indigenous populations that were, indigenous peoples navigating the complexities, but also the many possibilities that were offered by, cities. And today, Andrew and I will be discussing some of these common, topics. We will be focusing on Latin America. You know that the book is much broader than Latin America, but we will be mostly focusing on the Latin American region. And I will apologize myself in advance if I include too many Mapuche examples. But I already said that I've been working in the area of indigenous urbanization for a while. And I work with the Mapuche people, with and for the Mapuche people from a collective organizational point of view. So I work with Mapuche organizations in the city. So I hope I will try to be as, include several examples from other, countries as well. But just in case, why I am presenting the Chilean case quite a lot. And one of the first things that I wanted to discuss is the Latin American city, right? And in Latin America, the influence of colonial legacies is deeply embedded, is deeply part of the structure of urban environments, affecting, of course, the physical layout of Latin American cities, but also, social divisions and cultural landscapes. And understanding the indigenous experience within these frameworks, this urban framework, requires a look at the historical and also the ongoing practices, the ongoing processes of colonization and modern, nation building. And something that we discussed in the book as well is how cities in Latin America were envisioned and were developed by colonial powers as symbols of progress, of modernity, and whiteness. I will not explore this in too much detail because I know, Andrew will be looking at this topic, the connection between indigeneity and modernity, much in depth. But urban centers have been really key in shaping, colonial societies. And colonial urbanization provided organizational form to invasions, with cities constituting the foundations of settler colonial nations. And this has been deeply ingrained, of course, it's something from the past, right? It's a historical fact, but has also been ingrained in the social imaginary, even until the present day, today. Viewing urban spaces mostly as alien to indigenous identities. And despite many cities being emplaced even on lands that were, violently, stolen from indigenous peoples, and also cities are expanding. And this expansion has resulted in, stealing, it's kind of an active process, indigenous lands in several countries of the region and the world. And even when they appear, indigenous peoples in cities, in urban spaces, they were considered not to be fully indigenous. And we will be exploring this idea in more detail in our presentation. And this close association of indigeneity with rural spaces, or as the literature on indigenous urbanization also says, this idea of guardians of the forest, this continues to be very active throughout the 21st century, where these ideas of the authentic indigenous or the real indigenous continues to live in rural settings, far from urban life, and in a state of nature, and if not in a state of nature, in very close proximity and harmony with the rural setting. That continues to be rather present until the present, until today. And this vision has systematically excluded and marginalized urban indigenous, these urban indigenous, others in cities, deeply impacting social structures within cities, including also the racial segregation of neighborhoods in the region. And as a result, indigenous peoples faced, of course, intersectional challenges, being racialized, being classed, being gendered as subaltern others, which significantly complicates their struggle, the struggle for recognition, their struggle for equality. And here I wanted to bring an example, a rather recent example, from the Mapuche people. I told you that I was going to, sorry. And with a sustained, in the case of Chile, rural to urban migration, Mapuche, especially for Mapuche women, in search of better life possibilities, and again, especially migrating to the capital of Chile, to Santiago. An urban social imaginary developed in the country to this day, I would say, that links gender and race, gender and, indigeneity in this case, with the work of nanas, the work of domestic service, the domestic service arena. And hundreds of Mapuche girls, Mapuche teenagers, and Mapuche women have migrated, especially during the 80s and the 90s, from the rural territories of origin to cities to be employed as nanas. This is a Chilean word. I'm not sure if it's also used in other Latin American countries. You can tell me. As domestic, servants. And you can perhaps make the connection with this film, the Mexican film Roma. So it's not exactly the same reality, but you can perhaps imagine the general context through that film. And this, connection between race, class, and gender was materialized into a different, situation. This intersectional condition was made evident in 2014 during the performance of a singer in Santiago. I don't know if you know Ana Tijoux. Yeah, if there are any Chileans, Anita Tijoux. Any Chileans? If you don't know her, you perhaps know the festival of Lollapalooza. Yeah, there you are. And groups in the audience basically yelled "Nana face," cara de nana at her, as a way of insulting the singer because of her alleged, indigenous phenotype. And I discuss this, in more detail in my chapter of the book. But the bodies of indigenous women have been, in many instances, resignified as domestic service bodies, and either entrapped by the frame of the rural ancestral, this idea of the rural ancestral territory as rural people, or confined, by the borders of the urban household as nanas. And these marks of colonization, for instance, are evident in how resistant the city, the urban fabric is to indigenous presence, the indigenous presence. And another case that also illustrates this from the book is the Shipibo people in Lima. And this is also discussed by, the chapter by Juliana Borea. And she discusses this particular settlement in Lima is called Cantagallo. If there are people from Lima or Peru might be familiar with Cantagallo in Lima. And this is a space that used to be a dumping site. And still has, and you can see here a photo of Cantagallo without access to the most basic services, tap water, clean water, electricity. And as many other Latin American capitals, and Lima is just an example, Lima was for decades portrayed as culturally, as racially, ethnically white, and alien to Amazonian indigenous groups such as the Shipibo, and just to provide an example. And today, the presence of indigenous peoples in cities, challenges traditional notions of identity, of belonging, and rights as well, crossing social spatial boundaries in the middle of ongoing discrimination and coloniality practices. And traditional cities have been viewed, as the heart of progress and globalization, while indigenous territories are seen as spaces needing, progress and development, pushing states these violent approaches towards assimilation, strategies on indigenous communities. And of course, this is the result of, or has been exacerbated by, this neoliberal approach that some Latin American states have followed, which has also been reflected not only in terms of a territorial point of view, but also from an educational point of view in terms of how indigeneity has for decades been presented and has been discussed in the region as a myth for the nation state building process. This idea has been very present as part of the educational curriculum in some Latin American countries. And the incorporation of indigenous peoples into these narratives has corresponded with this idea of the melting pot conception, which was converted into a founding myth for many countries of the region. Like an ingredient, right? We have indigenous peoples, we have the Spanish, and the result is the mestizo, or this idea of the cosmic race. Or the idea of the mestizo as the racially mixed nations. And this is basically how indigenous peoples were presented for decades by the formal education system. And while it is true that a growing proportion of indigenous peoples live in cities, in Chile, for instance, is the majority, not only the Mapuche, but in general, mainstream narratives continue still to render urban indigeneity invisible and assume that indigenous groups remain confined to an idea of the ancestral homeland, not only physically, but also culturally. And once indigenous peoples leave their territories of origin, leave their homelands and move to cities, either by this idea of by choice or forced to do so, it has been assumed that urban indigenous migrants lose their connection with their ancestral territory, and by extension, because of this moving process, lose their identities, their indigenous identities, and become basically assimilated. And it's important to say that these discourses are not exclusive of the non-indigenous society, but have also been shared and reshared and replicated by rural indigenous communities themselves. And I will briefly explore that, time permitting, later, because I've already talked a lot. But this has also impacted how identities are being recreated and reconstructed in the city. 1 minute. Yeah, I feel the vibe.
Well, I just got an eye on the clock. We have until 15:15, right?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
flexible, right?
A little bit more.
Okay, go on.
So it is important to mention that the rural-urban divide, and I think this is also important because this was mentioned by my Mapuche collaborators and indigenous peoples in general. This urban, it's because it sounds like urban-rural is like a clear, divide. It is not. It is blurred. As individuals traverse and then redefine, different landscapes, challenging the notion of a separate rural and urban, division. From a geographical point of view, we have many, examples, including, from the book, for instance, this female Aymara Bolivian market vendors that have established themselves in different countries. So it's an international move as well. So crossing international borders to sell their products in Sao Paulo, for instance, in Brazil, or even in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. So establishing themselves in other Latin American, cities. But also, it is still important to highlight that the same understanding of indigeneity still entails at least a symbolic spiritual connection to the to this idea of their territories and communities of origin. And I know that Andrew is going to explore that in more detail in 4 minutes, right?
In 4 minutes?
Yes, when I finish with this. So one final aspect that I wanted to address in relation to this discussion is that while Indigenous peoples are subject to unique intersectional race, class, gender, just to name a few, obstacles and challenges, not acknowledging their agency in cities would be an unforgivable omission and even a mistake. Because it's not only Indigenous peoples who are impacted by urbanization, but also cities change with the presence of Indigenous peoples. And I think it's really important to mention that as well. So I would maintain that Indigenous presence in cities cannot simply be understood as, ghettoization, but also as a form of placemaking that contributes, culturally, economically to the urban fabric, challenging the narratives that restrict Indigenous peoples to discussions around, poverty and marginality only. So it's much more complicated and nuanced than that. We have, for instance, the case again of Cantagallo. So Indigenous people here, the Shipibo, were able to develop, an intercultural school. In Chile, the Mapuche are building ruca or traditional houses. You can see the first photo there. There are 21 traditional Mapuche houses located all around Santiago to recreate their culture, especially from a language perspective, in order not for the language to be lost, but spoken also by the younger generations. So the appropriation of urban spaces, even if these were previously unwanted sites like the Shipibo or the Mapuche, where this particular ruca is emplaced, where they were, unwanted, sites, this appropriation, even if symbolical, appropriation, because some of them are not entitled to the legal use of these spaces, the urban spaces, they have been occupying them, they have been squatting these places. This promotes the strengthening of a collective sense of Indigenous identity, which creates a new sense of belonging, but a new sense of belonging as Indigenous urban residents, as Indigenous urbanites in Latin American cities. Just one final point, also, Latin American states have responded to this increasing presence of Indigenous peoples through the enactment of a series of programs and policies. So if you are from Latin America, perhaps you are familiar with this idea of the intercultural, right? From a multicultural point of view, intercultural health, intercultural education. I put 2 examples here. Cumefelen Santiago Guarameo, this is an intercultural, medicine perspective. Here is from Peru, bilingual intercultural education. And this also leads to new potential, dynamics in which Indigenous peoples have been recruited to be part of the state and become ethno-bureaucrats. So urban residents working for the state in a very complicated role, representing their communities in front of the state and the state in front of their communities. So it's very intricate, very complex, the dynamics from a political perspective that are emerging in Latin American cities. So of course, urban indigeneity has introduced a series of social, political, and economic, practices and dynamics that are reshaping, indigeneity in the region.
Okay.
No, I mean, I can continue.
So thank you very much. I want to pick up on one very important thing that Dana said. So despite the title urban indigeneities, both of these terms are problematic. I'm going to talk in a minute about why indigeneity might be an issue. But so is the idea of the urban-rural divide. One of my books is going around, the one with all the pictures. That when I first went to this community in 1989, there was no road, you had to walk there, it was remote, everybody spoke Aymara, and the city was far away. It took 4 hours by bus and maybe 3 to 4 hours walking to get to the village. Now the city, so we're talking about the 2 different things here actually. One is how Indigenous people move to the city, but the city also moves to Indigenous people. So the last time I went, the first time I went, I had to carry everything on my back. And, the last time I went, there was a road and they all laughed at the poor quality of my telephone, right? Because they had much better phones than I did. And so I can follow people on Facebook. So communications about, and this is actually very, very important because, and in fact, Juliana's example as well, the idea of people go back and forth a lot. And, whereas before, even just to go to the next village to talk to my daughter, might take, I don't really have a daughter, if I had a daughter, anyway, you get the idea. Would take me an hour to walk. Now I can just call her, right? Or I can call my daughter in Buenos Aires, and so that has changed as well. So that is that. I think we also need to interrogate how urban, and not only have cities grown and grown and grown, but they're permeating indigenous life. And I was amazed. I was in the Ecuadorian Amazon this year. I had connection pretty much everywhere. I mean, I was quite amazed how connected I was on my. I got a better phone now, by the way. I was too humiliated by my colleagues.
Do you want me?
Yeah, no, I got it. So I want to interrogate, first of all, who is indigenous? If I have a feather in my head and I'm in a bow and arrow in the jungle, that's easy, right? Obviously, if you see me in a Hollywood film, you know I'm indigenous. But there are many ways of thinking about it. So, first of all, I can't see my own slides.
Okay,
yeah, good. Can we swap pages?
Yes,
so, what we can take kind of official definitions, the World Bank, the International Labour Organization, the United Nations, and since the mid-80s, they've been struggling with this definition. But there are some key elements. They all agree that well, first of all, self-definition, right? There's no objective diagnostic where I can say you are indigenous and you are not. It gets too complicated. And one of the things, and this is actually in some sense even more important, indigenous peoples exist within nation states. Now, this has a number of implications. First of all, and I'll pick this up in more later, is that if I'm a Zapotec from Mexico and I go to Los Angeles, I stop being a Zapotec. I become simply a Mexican, right? If all intents and purposes, in terms of the state that is, the United States does not recognize my indigeneity. Yeah, I'm just a Mexican. If I'm from Bolivia and I go to live in Jerez de la Frontera, there's lots of Bolivians in Jerez de la Frontera, a lot of Aymara speakers, I stop being an Aymara for all intents and purposes. The Spanish state does not recognize, I'm just another South American. And that's quite important. The other thing is that if you can imagine, why aren't, you can't be an independent indigenous state either, because once you're an independent, then you are a state. Then you're like Japan or any other country, right? So indigeneity does have this very, very important relationship to the state. And a lot of ambiguities and arbitrariness. So one way of thinking about being indigenous, I was here before you, right? But who am I, or who are my people, and who are you? And when is this before? So, for example, if I am from a Quechua speaker from Cochabamba in Bolivia, Quechua speakers, I'm indigenous. I speak Quechua, I'm indigenous. If you are descendant from the Spanish who came 30, 40 years after the Incas went to that part of Bolivia, you are not indigenous, okay? So who gets to be there before or not, it's complicated. And there are other examples. For example, if you go to India, many people there who are considered indigenous, tribal peoples, we know historically arrived after the majoritarian groups. Now, there is this problem of authenticity. Who gets to decide? Now, in some countries like the United States, the federal government decides by law. And so if you're an indigenous artist, you cannot sell your art as indigenous art until the federal government says you're indigenous. It's not enough for the local indigenous group to say, she is one of us, right? It has to be federally entitled. And what you get is actually, in different contexts, for different reasons, different bodies are deciding who is indigenous. And I want to get back to this idea of relations with nature. We all know that indigenous peoples are spiritual, and we all know that they're one with nature. Now, why? How is it that if you go around the world, you go to Australia, and you go to Bolivia, and you go to the Sami in northern Norway, all of these people, and they're so different. They're so incredibly different, different histories. They all have this nature thing. And that is a key, that if you go back to the World Bank, one of the key diagnostics, as far as I know, is this relationship with nature. And this has always bothered me. It's always bothered my entire career, because it tends to a kind of essentialism, right, of indigenous peoples in nature. And so this is something I have looked at. I'm going to come interrogate that a bit. Because there's something fundamentally, obviously false, right? That somebody in Australia, somebody in Bolivia has a common worldview. It would appear to be obviously false. It's actually not, but let's get, so one of the things is how indigeneity relates to modernity. So one way of thinking about indigenous peoples is that there were those people, right, who were outside European modernity, right? They are pre-modern. They are not civilized. Maybe we might even use the word savage, which is the word that was used at the time, right? So we might think of indigenous peoples today as survivors of the past, right? And so I know if you're really indigenous by how much of your pre-contact culture you retain today, right? That's how I know. And if you go to a court case in Canada and you're looking at territory, you have to prove, I would need to prove to the Canadian court, there's this continuity of culture. So we talked about the arbitrariness of time. So when European arrives, that's kind of the original culture, and anything after that is somehow less. And the problem with that is that it denies people history, right? So how many people here consider themselves Dutch? No one? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Forgive me, but you don't look Dutch. You're not wearing the clothing they wore in Rembrandt's time. You are not authentic, right? Now, that's clearly absurd. But yet, the same absurdity is, if you talk about, oh, you don't look indigenous, not dressed as indigenous. Why should they be? And the answer to the question is only because indigenous people are somehow outside of modernity. But I want to flip this, actually, and say this is absolutely rubbish. So that indigeneity is, and if you look at the well, like totally misspelled, Arturo, and you look at many, many others, they saw how the discovery of the New World was fundamental in constructing modernity. But what about the roles of Indians in creating modernity? And actually, I'm going to plug another book, if you don't mind. You got two for the price of one here, okay? There's another book with Manuel Lapic called Savages and Citizens, How Indigeneity Shapes the State. And what we're looking at here is how when Europeans were imagining the state, they had to imagine indigenous peoples. So one of the arguments in this book is that actually indigeneity is a product of Europeans' imaginations. Right? That before Europeans started in this idea of Locke, Baudin, and Rousseau, there were no indigenous peoples. So imagine going to a spaceship, a type, you go to what is now Latin America in 1400, you wouldn't find any indigenous people, not one. You'd find Inca, Mapuche, you'd find all of them, but they didn't know they were indigenous. It only makes sense that all of these diverse peoples are indigenous when you get into this colonial relationship. And what's interesting about these philosophers is that their interest in indigeneity was often, the depictions of indigenous peoples was often contradicted by empirical evidence, but they didn't care. It was important for them that indigenous people be savages, right? That they have no law, that they have no politics, right? And in the famous words of Thomas Hobbes, they're running around, very violent in a state of nature, beating each other up. They're free, but they're savage, and that's a really foundational part. And it gets back to we'll leave it there for now. Oops. It gets back to the idea of nature, because it's in this period that Europeans, in an interesting way, in an important way, distinguish between nature and culture. Until that point in our human history, that distinction was not very, very clearly kept. So to get back to my question, how is it that people in Australia and North Dakota and Bolivia have this relationship with nature? It's because Europeans are the weird ones. Until the 16th, 17th century, all humans had an intimate relationship with nature in one way or the other. You can interrogate me on this, and so the commonality is that these people are not products of this kind of very European, very 17th century thinking. So we can talk about the relationship without essentializing, which I think is very important. And one of the key things about these philosophers is that indigenous peoples must be outside or beyond the state. They're defined in terms of the state. They're beyond the state. So what we argue here, and this is part of what we talk about a bit in the introduction, that indigeneity is essentially a political relation. Right? It's not cultural. I cannot test you on your indigenous culture. It is meaningless. Right? And so I'm not going to try. Thank goodness. Yeah, but people get tripped up about that. What is real? What is not real? And this makes it profoundly anti-essentialist. This definition. Oh, sorry, I've already asked that question. I thought, so if you see that, this is important because you think about modernity and indigenous people as being outside of modernity, and indigenous people as being survivors of colonization, then urban indigenous peoples are a real problem, right? They don't fit the model. They're living in cities, they're driving, BMWs or whatever it is they're doing, and that's not proper, right? You have to be, where's the bow and arrow, please? And a feather is always good, right? And that stupidity is totally lost if you think about it in a radically different way. So the first thing is not to see indigenous peoples as being outside of modernity, but actually as products of modernity, as agents in the process by which modernity was constructed. And then when you think about, and getting back to this idea of relationship with the state, then indigenous peoples, what makes them indigenous is how they relate to that state, how well they belong to that state, how well they are seen to belong to that state, how they're excluded. And that kind of differentiated sense of belonging or exclusion is it's a really interesting way of thinking about indigeneity today. In fact, it always was, I would argue, and we would argue. So in terms of indigenous political organization, what indigenous people, and this is true around the world, whether it's Australia, whether it's Canada, whether it's in Norway, whether it's in Bolivia, whether it's in Chile, indigenous people are demanding a different kind of state. Not a state for themselves. Very rarely do indigenous peoples actually demand a state. They want a different kind of state, a different kind of citizenship, a different kind of way that people like us relate to the state. And so, as Dana mentioned, almost half, it depends on how you count them, but certainly about half, maybe more than half of indigenous peoples now live in cities. Now that can be a problem in terms of, let's go home, anthropologists, we're done with it, or we just look at the rural ones, but actually, if you think about it in this way, the urban indigenous are a really important way of thinking about. It's actually very exciting, the kind of critique of the modern, i.e., post-Westphalian European state, which always had holes in it. Another way of thinking about indigeneity, before I move on, is that the state always had holes. Right? You can think of James Scott's work in Southern Asia, looking at how the tribals, the people beyond the state, created cultures against the state. Right? So being indigenous is a political act. So we will go up into the hills because we don't want to be part of your state. And that's a very, very much more dynamic way of thinking about indigeneity as simply as survivors. They kind of made it to the 21st century. Great. And our view is much, much more historical, much more dynamic, and gives much more agency to indigenous people. They are agents of history. They're not just survivors or the kind of lost there. So I said that urban indigenous identities are very contemporary. Then it's not a problem. Actually, it's very, very interesting to look at because they are challenging all the way around the world how we construct, and actually with considerable success about differentiated citizenship. Against the liberal idea of one citizen, in those days male, and European, different ways of thinking about citizenship, and therefore different ways of thinking about the state. So their authenticity lies not in particularly ancestral cultural practices. You can keep your feathers at home, it's okay. But in different ways of being today, different ways of being in the present. It's not about the past, about the present. And that, I think, in terms of thinking about many things, is much more useful than the kind of essentialism. And everything. Over to you, I think.
Okay.
No?
No.
That's it?
Yeah.
There you go. There you go.
So I wanted to complicate this intervention from an empirical perspective, also based on the chapters of the book, because another important commonality in the chapters is this connection between indigeneity and authenticity. Not only in Latin America, but this is an interesting kind of finding, because this discussion of authenticity was very present in Japan, in Russia, in Fiji, as well as in Chile, Bolivia, etc., etc. And one aspect from the book is this idea of the malleability of indigenous identities in relation, to self-identification. And these categories of indigenous and urban, indigenous categories are, as the literature indicates, are context-specific, are redefined by the same indigenous individuals who identify as indigenous, right? They are hybrid, they are fluid, they are multifaceted, they are dynamic. And even I would add to this an extra ingredient, which is even the development of neologisms to better represent and explain the new urban reality. And do you remember that I said I was not going to engage too much with the Mapuche? Forget about that, because I wanted to introduce the final example from the Mapuche, and I put it
You've not
on
stopped talking about the Mapuche.
What?
You've not stopped talking about the Mapuche. Anyway,
No, the Shipibo and Aymara people as well. Anyway, I wanted to, yes, they are Mapuche, sorry. These are here, this image from the middle. And this is when I first started doing ethnographic fieldwork in Chile. And this was kind of an interesting experience that I had as a student of a PhD in sociology. I was expected to specify the identity of Mapuche individuals and Mapuche organizations in discussions with other Mapuche. So they were asking me how Mapuche other individuals and other organizations really were. And this was based on three categories, identity categories that were developed by the same indigenous people, by the same Mapuche. These were Muarriache, Champurria, and Ahuincado. I'm not going to explain each of these categories. We can do that in the discussion if you are interested in this. But each of these identity categories basically places the Mapuche individual and the organization, especially the urban Mapuche organization and individual, on a scale of Mapucheness, of Mapuche identity, which is called, and again, another neologism, the Mapuchometro. So you're measuring how Mapuche you are according to your peers. And these identity parameters are used by the Mapuche to measure the Mapuche identity of, other Mapuches. And you can see here, Mapuchometro pyramid, like a pyramid of Mapuche surnames. So how Mapuche you are based on your surnames. And this is an example. So instead of acculturation in the city, in many cases, there is a process of identity negotiation and resistance by the individual in front of the larger, indigenous group, a claim of membership, but a complicated one because this is being grounded in the city. And some Mapuche and indigenous people in general, not only the Mapuche, of course not, but indigenous people in general may strive to assert their identity when others, other members of the group, but especially those who are based in the homeland, in the rural setting, view them as not sufficiently indigenous. So there is a complex dynamic there as well. So the authenticity that Andrew was also discussing is not only questioned by, of course, the indigenous group, as in the case of the Mapuchometro here with the surnames, for instance, but also, questioned by non-indigenous people, which is, again, complicating even more this idea of identity. And the politics surrounding indigenous authenticity and urbanization are also troubled, with manipulation by external actors, with particular interests, economic, political interests, usually placed at the use of natural resources that are located in indigenous territories. Natural resources such as minerals, such as, in the case of Chile, water, which is becoming to be, really scarce. And one Mapuche leader with whom I've been collaborating for a long time told me, if we are pushed out of our territories into cities and not formally recognized as indigenous in urban areas either, our land and resources are left at the disposal of economic and political powers. So I'm building on what Andrew said, some states have tended also to demand this idea of authenticity, right? The use of feathers and this kind of, imaginaries that exist around indigenous peoples in order to recognize indigenous peoples who have been relatively untouched by history, so very attached to this idea of the past. Those who are able to comply with the social, with the economic and political criteria expected and required by states. And this has created a series of consequences in the way how indigenous peoples have responded to these, dynamics. With some indigenous people, some indigenous representatives, some indigenous, leaders, to more visibly assert their indigeneity, their identity, to even perform, to perform visibly their indigeneity, what could be understood by some as an authentic, indigeneity, by using again this idea of certain dress codes and other culturally significant practices to reinforce their identity within the group, but also to demonstrate that they are indigenous enough in front of the state and non-indigenous actors in general. And urban indigenous peoples occupy a unique intersection, dealing with these paradoxes of constant mobility. Mobility in terms of physical mobility, crossing borders, urban, rural, international, frontiers, but also identity, but at the same time, anchored, in tradition, this idea of authenticity and tradition. And they move, physically in cities, selling their products. And also, Andrew said at the beginning, some peoples, regularly move to their territories of origin for several reasons. And I'm finishing, okay. And we have already discussed how their identities are also in constant, motion. And some indigenous people, such as in the case of the Mapuche, such as in the case of the Shipibo, are also striving to reconnect with this idea of an ancestral and sometimes idealized indigenous past. And this is what also the chapter on the Shipibo people, Juliana Borea also says the Shipibo wanted to live together, to keep their identity and traditions and to feel safe and accepted.
Shall I go to my conclusions?
Yes, just wanted to basically highlight how important for this sense of identity in the city, the role of organizations are, because this is not happening as indigenous individuals, but indigenous peoples are coming together in organizations, in groups, either through family bonds or, united by a sense of common indigenous identity to claim the city back. And this is an active process happening in the cities, the capitals of Latin America, but also the cities of the region.
Okay, just very brief conclusions, because I know we're running out of time. I'll be brief. So what we do in this book, and I think is very important, one way of thinking about urban indigenous as being poor, culturally poor, economically poor, and not very authentic. What the examples show is a real dynamism. People are reinventing all the time what it means to be indigenous. And it might just be in the case of that Japanese example of hanging out in a particular restaurant, right, and being involved and looking at the culture through that one cultural space in Tokyo. She's from Hokkaido, an Ainu person, right, in that cultural space. It might be, Dana talked about, visible signs. It might be creating a very urban, indigenous 21st century sense of style, right? There's, and actually, if you look at Bolivia, Evo Morales did this with his suits. They were very modern, they were very stylish. Indigenous doesn't have to be hand sewn. It can be, it can be chic. It can be, and so there's a dynamism there. I think this is one thing that comes across all the chapters, is that these are people not just being hammered by history or modernity. They are actively engaging with the world around and creating new communities, new identities, and it's very exciting. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you to both of you. You managed. Let me invite Adriana to also kind of become visible in this screen to people who will watch this later. I think if you are okay standing there or sitting, what you like.
And you can sit there.
If I sit, it's too.
Yeah, but then maybe.
I'm afraid.
Yeah. Do you mind standing? I think
No, not a problem.
for other people it might be easier to see you. You can stand wherever you like. Yeah. Indeed, we are a little bit with a time issue, but as long as you manage between 5 and 7 minutes to present some key thoughts, we'll allow also for the others. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think there I will be quite brief because I think that the most important thing that I would like to say is that the volume presents some new coordinates that I consider of great value because they configure more or less a new parameters that will frame the topic of discussions about contemporary urban indigeneity. So I will just name them. One, indigenous peoples are present in urban contexts, and this is a global phenomenon. Not just present, but they are also contribute, reshape, and redefine the urban environment, considered traditionally a strange and alienating space for indigeneity, even excluding them in order to better profile modernity. Two, indigenous political agency and cultural preservation are possible in the cities. Three, urban indigenous narratives imagine a cultural past identified with their ancestral lands and a present that requires making and remaking of bonds and communities. Four, cultural transformation and continuity, authenticity, rethinking the notion of belonging, identity reconfiguration. An important question has been also posed, and that's number 5. Who has the power to decide who is and who is not indigenous? That idea of self-identification is very important to address and to constitute one of the parameters to discuss urban indigeneity. There is also in the book named that indigeneity resisted assimilation and survives, adapts, and innovates in modern cities. And one of the phenomenon that's mentioned there is cosmopolitanism of indigenous art. And I would like to stop a little bit there because I have an own example about that. It's an article that I wrote about an Andean writer, Ulises Gutierrez, and I couldn't quite find a word to define a literary strategy. And I called it deterritorialization of indigenous experience. What did I mean by this? It was the description of how the writer melt or fuse his sensorial emotional experiences of new Japanese landscape with his nostalgic remembrance of the Peruvian Valle del Mantaro. And that was what constitute a single description of his diasporical experience. So what the book is describing really is being corroborated in the practice. Another aspect that I would like to highlight, because as a result of this presentation of new coordinates, is that I found a golden mine for research. And that was a sort of redefinition of some traditional spaces that I would like to call in-betweens. I'm referring this way to the definition of common concepts already known from studies related, for example, to the dynamics of displacement between rural and urban areas and vice versa. Indigenous migrants seem to have discovered also the symbolic power of the movement itself. So from A to B, what is the importance of the movement itself? The fact that the movement is different from the objective, and that constitutes the sole gesture, constitutes a political gesture capable of generating discomfort in the state. I will give you an example. This was the case of the protests in last year in Peru, when indigenous organizations from the south announced they decide to travel to Lima to present their protest against the unpunished repression that the state exercised in view of the new government. Let's put it like that. The state tried to control the transport of the mobilization, and that activated an unknown network of indigenous actors in urban and rural areas, ready to support the journey. Folkloric artists organized concerts to gain funds. Camioneros provided buses for the people to travel, and vendors placed along the route to provide food to the travelers. This process revealed a complex rural-urban indigenous infrastructure ready to support the protests. An example that complies with the assertion of the volume that indigenous peoples have never been immobile. They, not only indigenous peoples in general, but also indigenous urban life is characterized by continuous motion. Some Latin American countries, like Brazil and Costa Rica, commemorate today, 19th of April, the Indigenous Peoples' Day. This volume recognizes the persistent tendency to exclusively place indigeneity in rural environments as a form of invisibility, and assumes the challenge to highlight aspects of a contemporary presence of indigeneity in cities around the world. Let's read. Let's celebrate. Let's discuss.
Thank you very much. Thank you.